Welcome back, sweet families, to the Call to Love podcast. As always, I am so grateful that you have chosen to spend your time with us today. And today we are going to be talking about desperate prayers for the adoptive parent's heart. And man, if you're an adoptive parent, you understand what I'm talking about because there are just many moments in the adoption journey where we just feel desperate for the Lord, whether that's helping us to say our initial yes, whether that is in the waiting for the fulfillment of what we feel like He's called us to, or whether we are walking through really, really difficult trials with trauma or behavior or loss and grief. There's just a lot of desperation that comes with that adoption journey. And so, here joining me for this conversation is author and fellow adoptive mom, Rachel Wojo. And we're going to be talking about her new book release, Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. I'm so excited for this conversation, you guys. Rachel, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It is an honor for sure. I appreciate all that you are doing.
Thank you so much. I feel like I already know you. I've followed your work for a while, not even realizing that adoption was a part of your story. So I cannot believe that I missed that. But I love the way that the Lord is using you through the written word. And so I just want to dive in first and let the listeners get to know you a little bit and share a little bit about your family and how adoption is a part of your story, Rachel.
Yeah. So it's such an honor to be here. I'm really excited because this is a piece of our story that I don't get to share very often. We have so much that we have covered in the years that I've been in ministry and the years Matt and I have been married that sometimes the adoption piece is overlooked. So it's really an honor to be able to share it in an intimate way.
I love
And
that.
I have to think first, I should explain to everyone that I grew up in a Christian home, went to church all my life and had Christian parents and went on to Christian college, married a preacher boy, what was called a preacher boy back then in the day. And we married, and then God gave us a beautiful little girl. Her name is Taylor. And after 4 of the 5 years that we were married, I discovered that my husband had been having an affair, and I was unable to get that marriage rectified and back on the right path, and found myself a divorced mom, single mom of a special needs child, a place I never, ever dreamed that I would be.
Yeah.
And God miraculously worked in so many situations, but mostly one of the biggest blessings of my life was when He brought Matt, my husband now of 25 years, into my life. And he and I met at the Cincinnati Zoo one day. Um, he was packing his little girl. Actually, she was 8 years old, so he wasn't packing her, but he was walking with his little girl, Tiffany, and I had my Taylor, who was 4 years old at the time, and she just fell in love with Matt at that time. And
Oh,
so we married and have 5 children together. So that's 6. We have 2 in heaven now. Fast forwarding all these years, our Taylor girl, special needs daughter, passed away January 2nd, 2019. She went to heaven. And we also had a baby that we lost in those years. Many years before that, between our Tara and Samuel. So to give you the rundown of who currently lives in our household, we have a daughter who lives next door. Her name is Tiffany. She's married to Zach, and they are in their 30s. And then we have 5 at home who are trying to escape us, but we're just hanging on to them as long as we can. They are Michael's 22, Tristina is 20, Samuel's 19, and then Tara and Tessa are 15 and 13. So it is very much a busy, bustling household, and that probably gives all of your mamas who are listening a picture of, oh, kind of like my house, you mean?
right. Exactly.
Oh,
I love that. That is so amazing. And thank you so much, first of all, just for sharing that part of your story. It just really helps us to get to know you better and to understand really the message that we're going to be talking about today, which is finding yourself in that place of desperation. And so, Rachel, as I mentioned, we find ourselves so often in places of desperation, just as daughters of the King, and then as wives and as moms, and then especially there's that added component when you talk about adoption or foster care, where it's just a really, really hard calling. And so, you talk about in your book specifically, and I've been reading through. Listeners, just I have a copy in my hands, and it is just, I haven't been able to really put it down since the publisher sent it to me. It is so fantastic and well written, and just the way that you share, and you talk more about Taylor and just that loss and everything that goes with that, and the raw and the real that you experienced, and the hard conversations that you had with the Lord. And so maybe let's start there for those of our listeners who might find themselves in that place right now where they're like, look, I am desperate. I'm crying out to the Lord. I'm not feeling the relief. I'm not feeling his presence. So where do we begin in talking about if we find ourselves, because we know really and truly, if we're not there right now, we're going to be at some point
Yeah,
because we live in a fallen world, right? And
exactly.
so let's just begin in talking about finding ourselves in that desperate place. Rachel, where do we begin?
The day that I got out of bed for the first time after Taylor had passed away, and trauma does a number to your brain.
Yeah,
Watching your child's body carried away by an unmarked white van is just something that no parent ever wants to go through. And so your brain is just a scrambled mess. I honestly couldn't pray because I couldn't even string two cohesive thoughts together in my mind, much less get them to come out of my mouth.
yeah,
And so, for the person right now who's saying, I'm a hot mess, I can't find words, I don't know how to think, I don't know how to pray,
yeah,
then I would just say, when you wake up in the morning, and this is what I had to do, I would wake up and I would think, okay, Lord, my eyes are open. My heart is beating. You have put oxygen in my lungs today for whatever reason. And so I know that the hardest words I ever have to say to myself is that I did not die when my daughter died. So,
mm,
Lord, you must have a plan for me. And that would just be the very first thought that I would just, open my eyes and say, get me out of this bed. Other people are relying on me. I have children. I have a husband. I want to serve them well. So help me. And that really was the crux of my prayer, was just, God help me. It seems
yeah.
very, very basic and essential, but that's the truth of what it was. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And you even talk about that of just like three-word prayers and those being sufficient. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think sometimes when we don't feel like we're being heard, it's because we're not praying the right way, or the Lord's not hearing us because we're not doing something right. Speak to that for us a little bit, Rachel.
Yeah. I had a Post-it note on my desk for the longest time that said, drop prayer perfectionism.
Mhm.
And for me, it was just, I really needed to get rid of all the ideology I had about prayer, because it was interfering with my ability to pray. I thought that it had to be a certain format, or I had to use a journal and the journal had to be full, or I had to use prayer request cards and I had to mark them off. And
Yeah,
I love prayer models, I love prayer guides, I love all of those tools. They're appropriate for a time, but I think that what a lot of us miss when we're in desperate situations and desperate circumstances, those tools sometimes are not feasible. They're
yeah,
just not, it's not feasible to be able to sit down and write for an hour or read for 30 minutes or whatever. And so I think dropping the perfectionism and just dropping the idea that there's only one right way and it has to be that way
yeah.
is first and foremost, in order to really draw close to the Lord. When Taylor passed away, that first month after everybody was back to school and my husband was back to work, and it was the first time in 22 years that I ever had a quiet house to myself.
Oh,
Because
wow.
even after my youngest had gone to school, I still had Taylor special needs with typically a nurse or an aide or someone else. There was always someone in the house. So I found myself alone, and it was really hard to figure out what to do with that. And
Yeah.
so I started painting the basement. I know some of you are like, what? But just keeping my hands busy and
Yeah.
finding, physical, tangible things to do was important. And I would just paint the walls and sing. I couldn't even sing. I would just listen to worship music and
Mm,
cry and paint and pray. And my prayers were like, basically, I don't know what I'm doing. God help me. God hold me. And they
yeah.
were all these short prayers that I just really believed surely there's someone else out there who needs that help of recognizing that there's power in prayer, not because of who we are or the words that we say, but because of who God is.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. I love that. And I love that you're talking about just doing simple, I
Mhm.
mean, really menial tasks, but sometimes that's all you can do. You're just like,
Right,
I've got to do something or just the next thing. And it's so
right.
true when you're dealing with, desperation, when you're dealing in grief, when you're dealing in trauma, our bodies just, I mean, we
Yeah.
really become paralyzed in a lot of ways
Yes.
in our ability to function well. And I think as we're talking about this, and again, our listeners represent all different facets of adoption or foster care, but every bit of it welcomes grief and trauma
Right.
in some form or fashion. And so
Yes.
to be able to wipe away that perfectionism, because it's so true, we
Mhm.
can't follow the model of quiet times or prayer time or just time with the Lord in general in the same way when we are in really difficult seasons of high
Right.
demand, of big behaviors, of high need, high caregiving need, like what you experienced with your daughter. And so I think that's a really, really great reminder in all of this. You said something in the book that I thought was really interesting. You said one must learn to put boundaries around trauma in order to respond to it appropriately. And so that struck me because a lot of times I feel like trauma just comes at us and we don't know what to do. And so it can really just kind of take us down and knock us for a loop and really disorient us. But to put boundaries around that trauma in order to respond to it. I think you were bragging on your husband in that chapter you were talking about. He was really, really good at that. And so can you talk about that for a moment for us of ways that we can, as we're laying down this perfectionism of prayer and how we interact with the Lord, we're seeking Him, we're giving Him the best that we're able to in a moment of desperation or in a season of desperation. What does it look like to put boundaries around trauma so that we can respond appropriately?
I think most of us as women, my friend Pam Farrell and her husband Bill have written a book called "Men Are Like Waffles, Women Are Like Spaghetti," and
Mhm.
it's this, classic book of explaining how great men are at compartmentalizing and how women just our emotions and everything flows together. The spaghetti noodle runs very quickly from dinner time all the way to prayer time, bedtime. It goes from church to the ball field. And so I think for us it's a lot harder to draw those boundaries, but I believe that prayer is one of those things that allows us to create that boundary because we can truly give it to God and then go to sleep. We
Yeah.
truly can. um, I think that those boundaries have to be sometimes writing it down so that we can see it on paper and recognize that, okay, it's down on paper. This is what it really looks like. Because when it's floating around in our minds,
Mhm.
it can feel really disjointed and discombobulated. And so we're trying to separate it out into categories. I really believe that the Lord calls us to just give things to him that we're not meant to bear anyway.
Mhm.
And when we do that, that's the boundary right there. I think the scary part is the opposite side of that is that we put God in a box.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how easily we can put God in a box and expect certain prayers to be answered certain ways, but we can't even categorize our own little issues and put boundaries around them so
Mhm.
that we can deal with them. I often say that I'm so glad God is in charge of the universe and I am not, because I have enough
Yes.
trouble with my little corner of it.
No kidding.
Oh,
That is so, so good. I love that, and I completely agree with that, and it's funny, not funny, but when we find ourselves in that place where we're just desperate, it's because we are wanting something that's uncomfortable or challenging to us personally to change. And so we're crying out to him for some type of, whether it's reprieve, resolve, an answer, something. It's really hard to get out of our own way and manage our own little corner, like you're talking about, and really just fixate on what we think we want that resolve to look like or that
mhm,
answer to look like. And so let's talk about that a little bit, Rachel, of just how to purpose to lay that expectation aside. And I mean, how do we pray when we're desperate? Are we asking God for specific things, or what are ways that we can release the expectations in prayer and just trust Him with whatever the outcome and the timing of when He's going to answer?
right. So even just that three-word prayer that we talked about earlier, God help me, that example, in 3 words, you're saying, God, you are God, and I am not. I
Yeah,
mean, by addressing him, that's the first thing you're saying. And then help, or whatever verb you fill in. So in each chapter in the book has 15 different short 3-word prayers, and you can fill in the blank with whatever that verb is. But it is the word help really is just saying, I'm not capable on my own. And so I've got to have you, Lord. I've got to have
yeah,
you. I don't know what else to do. And then the me is the surrender portion. And so if you are surrendering yourself each time you pray, you're acknowledging, God, you have the power, I don't. Then when you bundle all of that up and you just say, God, I I don't even always have the words. I don't even have 3 words. Sometimes the most effective word is a prayer is just Jesus, just
yeah,
inviting him into whatever the situation is. I mean, I've had plenty of times where I haven't known how to deal with a child's behavior, or have not known what the best decision to make for a terminally ill child. And
yeah,
I've just said, Jesus. And it was just a surrender. It was just an invitation to admit, God, you are God. I am not. I'm not even going to pretend to have a suggestion for what the answer is. And so then when you float that over into God's timing, we use that phrase so much in the Christian world, God's timing.
yeah,
And the truth is that God is time. He himself is time. He was in the beginning. He is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So
that's
for
it.
him, there truly is no time as we think of it as human beings. And it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that,
Yeah.
because we think of everything in time and space. But I don't know. I guess I would throw it back to you a little bit and ask, what have you seen in regards to God's yeses, God's nos, and God's timing when you think about it?
Yeah, he's working on me with that right now because I think I'm in a season of understanding that so many times that he didn't respond or he responded with a no, that was actually a blessing. And in not giving me something that I thought that I wanted, or even pursuing something that on paper was good, was not best and not in his will. And so you're right. And I love that perspective of you talking about he is time. And so we're like, tapping our watch going, Lord, I've been praying. I've been talking to you for 6 whole days about this, or whether maybe it's 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, or, whatever that might be. The point is our pursuit of his presence and his
Right, right.
guidance for us. And I think that's where he is really speaking to me in this season and has taught me, through our listeners know this, multiple failed processes. I'm like, Lord, why wouldn't you fulfill this? Why would you call me to something that you wouldn't fulfill? Well, in time and in his goodness, he allows me to see and understand things when he knows my heart and my mind are ready to receive
Yeah,
them. And that's been a big thing for me in understanding, like, okay, yes, you went through these experiences for a reason, not for the fulfillment and the result that you would have expected, but he's known all along. what
Right.
that was gonna look like for me, and so it really was a shift in expectation, not of a result, but just of his presence, and that's
Right.
been huge.
Yes. Along that line, I think there are two things that I would say in response to that. One is that God wants to do so much more than give us the answers to our
Yes,
prayers.
that's
He
right.
wants to be the answer to our prayers. And then secondly, I think that so many of us struggle with the idea of God's timing because we don't understand the concept that He is not orchestrating only our lives, but
Mm,
also the lives of everyone else in the entire world.
exactly
So
right.
we don't have any way to know what piece of the puzzle, what piece of the tapestry the no was in someone else's life and how that affected them and how the answers that were no's to you could have been the answers of yes to someone else.
Yeah,
Your answers you received from God on what you thought were no's could have been because someone else was receiving a yes as a result. And so just understanding that the tapestry of our lives is not just our story, but all of history, all of it.
right,
And when we can zoom out a little bit and get that perspective of, okay, this is not just about my story, this is about God's story. And I always say that it's our good and God's glory, and those two things are never separated from each other. So when we
yeah,
can understand that our good and God's glory are never separated in His ultimate plan and His way and His will, then it can be just, I feel like, revolutionary to our thinking
yeah,
because in the culture that we live in, we're all taught that it's me, my.
right,
And so, as adoptive parents, we're knowing that it's not about me and we're knowing it's not about my, but then we still have these rooted desires and expectations of what we want it to look like. And
right,
it's challenging to separate ourselves from that thinking and
yeah,
really just devote ourselves to what the Holy Spirit has for us in
yeah.
along the way.
That's so true, and I love that you share that, and there's this balance between understanding you say history, and people will say, "Well, it's his story." He's writing all of that, and we get to be a part of it, and, he carries us through that, through the hard and the broken parts of our story, and, I think about the adoptive parents, the foster parents who are listening right now, and their children are wayward. Their trauma is such that they are really having a hard time experiencing the love that we are offering to them as their caregivers, as their chosen caregivers, as their parents. And that's a really difficult thing. And many parents who are walking that road find themselves desperately praying on a regular basis. And so having that perspective of it's not about us, their success is not a reflection of our effective parenting. We are not their rescuers. We are not the ones who are meant to come in and heal everything. We're a part of that story, and God has chosen us to help contribute to that. But ultimately, it's His story that He's writing through them as well, and we're just a part of that. I feel like it's
Mhm.
very. It sounds really complex, and guys, I don't know. I geek out on conversations like this, so bear with me. But I love it because it really is freeing because we do get in our
Yes.
heads so much, and we're like,
Mhm.
okay, God's not listening to me, or God's mad at me, or God doesn't like my child, or I didn't hear from God properly because XYZ didn't happen or isn't happening. And that's not the case.
Right.
He is all throughout every single one of our stories so personally, regardless of how we interpret how it's going. Right, Rachel? So I feel like
Mm.
it's very freeing for us in how we pray and how we experience that desperation. Would you agree with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. So, so true. I know that in my own situation, I think one of the things that people ask a lot after reading Desperate Prayers is, how did you know that God was speaking to you?
Yes.
Because there are several times throughout the book where I talk about how I learned to hear God's voice.
Yeah.
And it was a journey and a process. And God speaks through His word, His spirit, and His people. And I think most of us want one of those more than the other. And so when we say we want to hear God, most of us are like, like hit me with lightning over the head and blow it into my ear so that I know for sure it was you.
Yeah.
And the way that we begin to hear God speak is actually first through reading his word, because his spirit speaks through his word. It's unlike any other book that we read.
Mm.
And so when we're absorbing that, it allows us then to open ourselves up to hearing him through other people. Or, you've gone to a Sunday message and your pastor's gotten up to speak. And at the end, you were like, that was just for me. I know that was just for me. And everybody else is saying the same thing because the Spirit was prevalent and speaking through the pastor,
That's
and
right.
each person heard what they needed to hear, and how God uses that. But I think that happens more often than we actually are aware of.
Mm,
And the problem is not that we can't hear God. It's actually that we're not even trying to listen.
that's
And
good.
so if we can just flip ourselves, we want to hear God, but we only want to hear him say what we want him to say. And so if we can shift our heart and really that is the crux of what I learned with having a special needs child who was terminally ill and suffering day by day, is that you really have to decide whether or not you believe God is who he says he is.
Right.
And I hope that's helpful to someone who's trying to hold on to an answer that they're longing to hear,
Mm,
and just recognizing that he's working in a million ways. And even though you may not be getting that specific answer, when you lean in and get so close to him, he starts to speak to you and reveal things to you. You see things that you wouldn't otherwise see.
that's right.
I say often that one of my biggest fears was, after taking care of a neurologically degeneratively ill child for 22 years, I was afraid that I would forget how much I needed God,
Mm,
because Taylor kept me tethered to Jesus. And so I thought, when she dies, I'm going to forget how much I need the Lord.
oh,
And
wow.
I'm so thankful that the journey was deep enough that I have not forgotten that. And that
Yeah.
when I do maybe start to try to operate in my own way, the Lord quickly reminds me. He's so generous to remind me of how much I need him. So
Mm,
I hope the person listening today can just say, you know what? If she started to see good in the really hard spaces, then I probably can too, because
mm.
God is with me. His presence is there.
That's beautiful. I love that. And that is the heart. I think that's where the Lord wants us to land. And he uses a million different circumstances and personalized circumstances. And he's so good to be patient with us until we reach that understanding. And so I love that you share that, Rachel. And it speaks to anywhere that we find ourselves in the adoption or foster journey. That speaks to us right there. So that's so encouraging. I want to go back to Taylor's adoption just a little bit.
Yeah.
It's such a special story, and I feel like it would just really bless our listeners to hear that. So, would you share that with us, and just how sweetly the Lord ordained all of those details?
Yeah. It was one of those moments where you feel like in your life you're in a movie, because
Yeah.
it just almost seemed like it couldn't even be real. Is this really true and happening? Our Taylor had, as I said, a rare neurological disease. She was gradually, losing skill day by day, year by year, very slow process on the skills that she was losing, and that process of losing them. But at age 6, she was unable to speak anymore. She said very few words between the age of 6 and 9. She gradually she could mostly walk with assistance. Once you know, even as a teenager, she was still walking a lot with assistance. Didn't Was never really wheelchair bound until the last few months of her life. She stopped being able to support her own weight, but Matt, my husband, had been such a strong presence and caregiver for her entire life. From the time that we met at the zoo when both of us had those little girls holding our hands all the way until, after we got married, after we had our other family that I talked about, 5 more children. Matt was just a faithful, faithful father. He was a provider, and there's so many ways that he loved our family well. Not just our biological children, but Taylor, and loved me well. And so you couldn't ask for a better father,
Mm.
but he was not carrying the label of being her father. And most of that was because he wanted to give Taylor's birth father the honor of continuing to be her father. And when Taylor turned 18, her birth father gave the guardianship rights over to me. He had not seen Taylor since she was 12 years old. And so I took on those rights. And I just don't think for those 4 years that either Matt or I ever thought about adoption because she was over 18. But I think in the last year of her life, and especially right before she began to get really sick, Matt came to me one night and said, I feel like I'm supposed to adopt Taylor. And
Mm.
it took me a little bit by surprise because in my mind, he was already her father. I mean, he
Right.
had given his entire life to caring for her in so many ways. I mean, you all know what I mean by so many ways, like cleaning up the throw up and, helping carry her around the house, up and down the steps, and just so many ways every day, caring for her, loving on her. And I said, I don't know anything about adoption, but I'll just see what I can find out. And so we started the process, and I thought, I didn't know that normally adoptions are a 6-month process. I had no idea. But I started the paperwork, and when we started the paperwork, we were assigned a guardian ad litem who would come into the home because Taylor was unable to go to the court at that time. She was too ill. And so we started all of this paperwork, and we were afraid. We didn't know. She wound up in the hospital. And honestly, I was still in a little bit of denial. I thought, well, we'll come home from the hospital and everything will be back to normal the way it was. I didn't realize that she was as sick as what she was, and that she would go to heaven within like 21 days after that.
Mm.
But while we were in that process, the guardian ad litem was finally assigned. It took about 3 weeks from the time that we filed the paperwork. And we explained to her, look, we don't even think Taylor's going to live much longer. They've kind of told us that if she doesn't start eating and drinking, then, she might have 3 weeks is all at the most. And so we decided, the guardian ad litem said, well, I'm willing to come and fill everything out immediately. And she did. And she filled out all of the necessary paperwork. And so just miraculous story after story. For instance, an attorney came in to where my husband was working. He was a patient of his, and brought up the discussion of adoption. And Matt said, well, actually, we're going through an adoption right now. And he explained, and the attorney was in such a position that he could put in a favor for us. And
Oh, wow.
so it expedited the process of allowing that adoption to go through. So the Monday before the end of the year, on Monday that week, they said to us, if you can come down to, actually, no, I'm sorry, it was on Thursday, and we went to the court on Friday. You can come down to the courthouse on Friday, tomorrow, and be here before 2:00. We close at 2. So you probably need to be here by noon. Then we will get you assigned to a judge, and you can go in and have the hearing. And so it just was crazy. I had sisters in town by chance, and just the way the Lord orchestrated for us to be able to go down to the courthouse for my biological children to witness their father become the actual father of our sweet Taylor.
Mm,
And I didn't know this, Summer. I'm sure you know this, but I did not know this. I did not know that when a child is adopted, their birth certificate is reissued with the name of the parent who is adopting them as if that parent were present at the time they were born.
mm,
And so Taylor passed away. This happened our hearing was on December 31st, and the very last day of the year that it could be. And Taylor passed away on January 2nd.
mm.
So about 2 weeks later, after she passed away, we got her birth certificate in the mail with her new name. And then about a week later, we got her death certificate in the mail with her new name.
Wow.
And so it's just one of those moments where you're opening the mail and you're saying, Lord, I don't even know how you did this. It is so miraculous. And I realized later that part of what was bothering Matt, I think, was that he knew the time was coming when he would be driving by a cemetery, seeing Taylor's stone by her grave. And
Yeah.
he really wanted his name to be on that stone because he felt like she was his.
Yeah.
And God gave him that privilege. God gave him that honor. And I'm still astounded by all of the details and how quickly they worked out. I haven't told that story a lot, and so I probably didn't do as good of a job of it maybe as what I did in the book, hopefully. But but
Yeah.
God is so amazing in how He allows us to have. I mean, if someone loves so much as a human being, imagine how much greater the love of our Father is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good and it's so beautiful. And I appreciate you sharing that. And it's just so touching. And as you were sharing that and you were talking about all the details that came together for you to experience that, I think it brings us back to this idea of desperate prayers and
Mm,
recognizing all of the ways that the Lord ordained the details, met you every step of the way,
mhm.
reminded you along the way because your heart was attuned and you were seeking him and all of that. I think it just relieves our desperation a little
Mm,
bit and it just makes us desperately grateful. Like, Lord, how
yeah,
can I possibly praise you enough when I fully understand how much you are in this life with me
yeah,
and in my story? And so I don't know, that's what came to my heart and my mind as you were sharing that. And I think in my own story, I can see that and just the ways that the Lord has met us, he's given us guidance through things that in just ways that we would never have even thought to ask him, but he in his
mhm.
goodness did that. And so listeners, I pray that this conversation's been a blessing to you. Rachel, is there anything that you would say just in closing to specifically our adoptive or our foster parents right now who, just in a word of encouragement as it relates to desperate prayers as they walk their journey?
Yeah. I think desperation really fuels a dependence on God like nothing else.
Yeah.
And so what God has invited you into right now is a holy privilege. It's a
Yeah.
holy privilege because it's an opportunity to get to know him on a level that you otherwise wouldn't. And so don't don't miss that opportunity because it's rich. There's so much joy in it, and you learn how to commingle and hold together the joy and the sorrow, recognizing that one makes the other sweeter. So I'm praying right now, and in fact, if it's okay with you, I'll close in prayer that
Yes.
we would just allow these desperate spaces to create a dependence on God, that us to see him in a new way, experiencing him in a new way, and recognize that only in heaven will we ever be able to grasp everything
Mm,
that God did for us on this side of eternity. But until then, He has a job to do and allows us to partner with him.
Yes.
So I just pray that the one who's really, really hurting right now can start to open their eyes to the gift of his presence, the gift of his promises, and mostly the gift that prayer is, that allows us to communicate with him and receive the direction and the peace that we need, that panic drives us to peace.
Yes. Oh, amen and amen to that. That is absolutely fantastic. So uplifting and just challenging in the best way. Rachel, I want to make sure that our listeners can connect with you further and they can get a copy of the book, Desperate Prayers. Guys, like I said, I'm reading it right now. Cannot recommend it enough. It is just a fantastic resource. And now that you know the person and the heart behind it, it just makes it that much sweeter. So, Rachel, how can they do that?
Yeah, great way to do that is just to go to desperateprayers.com. And we have a lot of different resources there. There is a class on how to be a prayer warrior for your family in dark times.
Mm,
It's full of tools and resources, really easy ways that you can latch on to pray for your family when you're in deep struggling. Simple things that I think will be maybe new ideas that you haven't thought of before, that can just be perfect little tools for the hard times.
yeah.
And then the book is there as well, with all kinds of resources, discussion guide if you want to go through it with a group, or all sorts of other things. So would love to connect with you there at desperateprayers.com.
Fantastic. Okay. Friends, I'll have that link in today's show notes. And what a great point. I love that you talk about that. When we're going through a desperate season, it's not just us. It
Right.
affects our entire family.
Yeah.
And so what a fantastic resource to have to guide not only yourself, but your family through that. So what a blessing. Rachel, thank you so much for being my guest today. It has just been an honor.
Oh, my privilege for sure. Thank you for having me.